Well, thanks, folks, for coming to see this presentation. I think the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff is just an amazing bit of history that not a whole lot of people know about, although it's gotten publicity more in recent years. But it's a fascinating story, and what we'll do is talk a little bit about the ship and how it became to be, and then the events leading up to the sinking, and then from a trip that we took in 2003. I've got some underwater slides and then a video which was produced by Andy Aston, who's in the UK, and he's actually on this call as well. A little bit about Wilhelm Gustloff. Wilhelm Gustloff was the leader of the Nazi Party, and he lived in Davos, Switzerland. And his primary function was to spread Nazi propaganda and to report back any discontent back to Berlin of any of the German nationals living in Switzerland. He was also a meteorologist, and they actually sent him down to Davos down there because of the good weather in Davos. And David Frankfurter was a Jewish medical student. He lived in Bern, Switzerland, and he was growing concerned with all of the anti-Semitic activity that was going on in Switzerland as well as Germany. And he just became obsessed with Wilhelm Gustloff, and he traveled from his home in Bern, Switzerland to Davos, and on February 4th, 1936, he knocked on Gustloff's door. Gustloff's wife, Hedwig, answered the door and invited him in, and when Gustloff appeared, David Frankfurter shot him 4 times and killed him, and then he turned himself into police. Now, Gustloff was a friend of Adolf Hitler. So Adolf Hitler decided to take advantage of the situation and kind of make Gustloff a martyr. And so they had a state funeral for Gustloff that went all through Germany on a procession with horses and carts, and through various towns in Germany. And on February 12th, 1936, Hitler delivered Gustloff's eulogy. And during the eulogy, he announced that a ship that was being built in Hamburg that would have been named Adolf Hitler would now be named Wilhelm Gustloff. And the Gustloff is almost 700 feet long, 25,000 tons. It was designed to carry 1,463 passengers, and it was really designed to be a passenger ship and cruise ship for the KDF, which was a movement, translates to strength through joy. And the idea is it would provide subsidized cruise for German workers, workers who could never afford to go on cruises that were typical in those days. And it had some interesting design features with it. It was a single class ship. There was no first, second, or third class. All the cabins were equivalent size, regardless of the status. And the passenger cabins were only in the out cabins facing out to sea, and had large free decks, comfortable dining and seating area. And it was the flagship for the KDF, the Strength Through Joy movement. And it was launched on May 5th, 1937. The picture on the right, Hedwig, Gustloff's wife, is actually christening the ship. And standing in the group right behind her is Adolf Hitler. And these are just some pictures taken from the ship, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. Upper left-hand corner, obviously, is the bridge. The lower left-hand corner is the promenade deck, which is really reminiscent of a lot of the pictures you see of the Andrea Doria of the promenade deck. And then on the right, the upper boat deck. And the Gustloff was not a real opulent ship like some of the passenger liners of that day. It didn't have a lot of the features and fixtures that a lot of the ocean liners, the English and the French and American liners did at that time. You've got the dining room in the upper left, the fest hall. It did have a swimming pool, and then the music hall in the lower right. These are just some pictures of the Gustloff while it was in service. You can see it was actually really quite a beautiful ship. You'll notice on the funnel, there's the swastika from the part of the KDF and the Nazi organization. And the way that the Gustlof worked, workers would take short cruises, and in the summer they would go up in the North Sea and up in the Norwegian fjords, and in the winter, in colder weather, they would go down to Italy and through the Mediterranean. And from March of 1938 to August of 1939, more than 65,000 passengers were aboard the Gustlof. These are just some different pictures that I got from various sources online and from books of passengers enjoying themselves on the Gustlof. And September 1st, 1939, things changed. Germany invaded Poland and World War II begins. It didn't take long for Germany to basically overpower Poland, and I was going to say there. Anyway, Germany quickly overpowered Poland. Sorry. And during that time, the Gustlof was converted to a hospital ship, and it served as a hospital ship from September 39 to November 1940. Participated in both the Polish and the Norwegian campaigns. And during the Polish campaign, actually, the first troops that it actually treated were Polish troops. But it treated both Polish and German patients during the campaigns in Poland and in Norway. And pictures, here you see the Gustlof with the stripe on it. It's a green stripe, and then it had a red cross on it to identify it as a hospital ship. And the pictures on the bottom were just various pictures taken during the time that it served as a hospital ship. And in November 1940, the Gustlof was moved up to Danzig Bay, which is now Gdynia, Poland. The Germans had renamed it to Gothenhaven. And it was up in this area from November 1940 to January 1945, and it served as a accommodation barracks and training area for the U-boat training command. Several of the ships that were used in the Strength Through Joy movement, the KDF, served as barrack ships for the U-boat training command. This is where all of the sailors that manned the U-boats came through at one point. U-boats that terrorized the United States and Great Britain and all through the Atlantic. This is where they trained at. And this is where the Gustlof spent the majority of its life, just over 4 years up in this area. The picture in the lower left is kind of interesting. In the background is the Gustlof being painted gray. It had been painted white, and now it was actually a legitimate target, and it was being painted gray to give it somewhat some camouflage. In the foreground, the ship in the foreground is called the Lowe, which is a torpedo boat, which plays an important role later in the story of the Gustlof. And just to give you some geographic references to where this is at, Gdynia and Danzig Bay is in Poland, and I've got a red circle around it there, and you can see the Baltic and Poland and Germany and Denmark to just give you kind of a reference as to where this is at geographically. Well, in January 1945, the Russians break through the Eastern Front. Initially, in the beginning of World War II, the Russians and the Germans had a non-aggressive pact, and they decided that they weren't going to fight one another, but then Germany attacked Russia, Operation Barbarossa, and Russia became on the Ally side and fighting against Germany. And in January 1945, they broke through the Eastern Front. And the way that this geographically worked, prior to World War I, Germany had Prussia. It was West Prussia and East Prussia. And part of the Versailles Treaty program allowed an area known as the Polish Quarter that gave Poland access to the sea, because prior to that point, Poland had no access to the sea. So there was a division between Germany proper and East Prussia. And when the Russians broke through the Eastern Front, one of the things that the Germans wanted to do is get as many people away from the Russians as possible. They had been in brutal combat for years, and the Russians were being quite unforgiving as they came through the German front. So they were trying to get as many people out of East Prussia as they could, evacuate them further to the west. And this was really Karl Donitz, who was, prior to this position that he was working in, he was in charge of all of the U-boat force. And of course, he later succeeded Hitler after Hitler committed suicide. But later in life, Karl Donitz said that he considered this Operation Hannibal as one of the most successful things that he did, because between January 23rd and May 8th, 1945, between 800 and 900,000 German civilians and 350,000 military personnel from occupied Poland and East Prussia were evacuated to Western Germany and Denmark. As the Russians advanced, things began to panic. People began to panic, and they started to converge on the easiest way to get out of there, which were the ships that were in Danzig Bay. And the Gustlof, which had been basically idle for 4 years, it hadn't even run its own power plant or hadn't got underway for 4 years, was one of the first ships to participate in evacuating people out of the East Prussia and Danzig Bay area. And initially, the plan was to have roughly about 5,000 people aboard the Gustlof. But as more and more people came to where the Gustlof was located, they started to take additional people on board. The picture in the bottom right there was taken from a still from a movie. That's not an actual picture of the Gustlof. It was taken from a still picture from a movie, but gives you an idea of the number of people who were trying to get aboard the Gustlof. And the general plan was for the Gustlof to sail from Gothenhaven, Gdynia. It was originally going to drop off the Navy personnel that were going to be on board in Kiel, and then continue on to Denmark to drop the refugees off. And on January 30th, 1945, 12:30 in the afternoon, the Gustlof gets underway for the first time in years and departs with more than 10,000 refugees and Navy personnel aboard and wounded soldiers. It was minus 18 degrees centigrade, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather was deteriorating. Initially, they were going to travel in a convoy, but two of the other ships that were involved in that convoy had mechanical problems and had to turn back. So the Gustlof was getting underway with a single escort, the torpedo boat Low. And the Gustlof was actually there were 4 captains on board, but the 2 primary captains were Frederick Peterson, who was a civilian, and he had been the captain of the Gustlof prior to it moving up to Danzig Bay. And then Captain William Zahn, who was in charge of the military people on board. And the 2 didn't see eye to eye, and they didn't get along, and they argued on the best route to take and course to steer. Zahn wanted to hug the coastline to make sure that they could stay away from Russian submarines, and Peterson wanted to take the mine-swept channel further offshore, because the risk of being inshore was that area had quite a few mines in it, and they wanted to avoid those. And they also debated whether they should steer a straight course and get there to the destination as fast as possible, or a zigzag course. And ultimately, they decided to take the offshore route through the mine-swept channel and steam in a straight line. And you have to imagine what it was like aboard the ship at that time. There were 10,000 people aboard a ship that was really designed to carry 1,400 people. And they were crammed in every single place possible. Many were seasick, the weather was deteriorating, the restroom facilities were overflowing. But just about everyone aboard was happy that they could be there, and because they felt that they were getting away from the Russians. And just after 8 p.m. in the evening, they broadcast a live speech from Hitler, which was commemorating the 12th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power. It turned out to be one of the last speeches that Hitler actually broadcast in public as well. Shortly after that, they received a message that a convoy was traveling in the opposite direction, and they made the decision to turn the running lights on. Up until that point, they'd been traveling in the dark. And that decision to turn the running lights on really kind of sealed the fate for the Wilhelm Gustlof. And the picture on the bottom there is the last known picture of the Gustlof as it was steaming out of Danzig Bay on January 30th, 1945. And offshore of where the Gustlof was sailing, was the Russian submarine S-13 under the command of Captain Alexander Marinesko. And this is what he wrote after the war. When I saw a silhouette of an ocean liner, it was enormous. It even had some lights showing. And there and then I decided it was about 20,000 tons, certainly not less. And I was quite sure it was packed with men who had trampled on Mother Russia and who were now fleeing for their lives. It had to be sunk, and I decided the S-13 would do the job. And Marinesko, they fired 4 torpedoes, and each of the torpedoes had a message written on it. Torpedo 1 for the motherland, Torpedo 2 for Stalin, Torpedo 3 for the Soviet people, Torpedo 4 for Leningrad. As it turns out, Torpedo 2 for Stalin got hung up in the tube, and they had to take emergency actions to disarm it before it exploded. So when the initial torpedoes hit the Wilhelm Gustloff, Marinesko and the crew of the S-13 were busy trying to disarm that torpedo and actually didn't see the torpedoes hit, but they saw the damage later. The 4 torpedoes, or the 3 torpedoes that hit the Gustloff, the first one hit the bow, which is where the crew's quarters were. And most of the crew were the people who could operate the lifeboats and assist in any effort at all to try to get people off of the ship. Second torpedo hit a little further aft, and it actually hit where the swimming pool was located. And also, this is where the more than 300 members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary were located at. And there were only 2 survivors from that group. And the third torpedo hit the engine room, which knocked out all the power and the lights, and the emergency lighting came on shortly afterwards. But you can only imagine you have more than 10,000 people on a ship that certainly didn't have enough lifeboats. Most of the people, although most of the people did have life jackets, they were faced with jumping in the freezing cold water. And in the 70 minutes that it took for the Wilhelm Gustloff to sink, more than 9,000 people perished. There were approximately 1,200 survivors, 1,230 survivors. The Lowe and several other ships, including the cruiser Admiral Hipper, stopped to rescue as many people as they could. The Admiral Hipper didn't stay very long because it knew that there was a submarine in the area, and they were concerned that they could possibly get torpedoed as well. But I can only imagine what it was like for these people during this period of time. The Baltic is absolutely freezing cold, and to experience something like this is just unfathomable. Interestingly, the last survivor that was recovered was 7 hours later. One of the ships was going through looking through lifeboats, and they found an infant wrapped in a wool blanket in a lifeboat full of frozen corpses. And that was the last survivor that was recovered from the Gustloff. And interestingly, later, the seaman that found the infant later he and his wife adopted the infant because they didn't know, they had no identification at all as to who it was. But when you look at it, the Gustloff was technically a legitimate target. It did have military personnel aboard. It did have some anti-aircraft guns aboard, so it was essentially armed. But the vast majority of the people on the Gustloff were civilians, women and children, a lot of infants on board. And no matter how you look at it, right or wrong, they were all sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, and they were all trapped in the madness of war. After the war, the Gustloff story just kind of faded away. The Germans lost the war, and history kind of tends to follow the victors. And unlike many wrecks like the Titanic and Lusitania and things like that, which are very common in history, the Gustloff was not many people really knew about it. And I was in a used bookstore just outside of Washington D.C. in the 80s, the mid to late 80s. And I was just looking through books, and I came across this book, The Cruelest Night. And I read the jacket. And at that time, I'd been diving, and I knew a lot of the history about a lot of the wrecks, of course, that we dive along the East Coast and some of the more famous wrecks. But I read the back jacket on this book, and I was just blown away that I'd never heard of this ship. Here's the the greatest loss of life in any single maritime disaster, and I'd never heard about it. And at the time, I had I didn't know anyone in Germany or Europe, and had no way of thinking that I'd ever get to dive this wreck, but it was always in the back of my mind, and I read it several times over the years. But in 1999, I had the opportunity to move to Germany for my job. And with no joking, the very first thing that came to my mind was the Wilhelm Gustloff. I'm closer to getting a chance to dive the Wilhelm Gustloff. So this book is well read, and it's been part of my library for quite some years. When I got to Germany, I had no real contacts for diving in Europe at that point. And I started to ask around and try to find somebody who knew anyone who could help get to the Wilhelm Gustloff. And Uli Rustemeyer, he's got a business that he runs up in Wismar, up in the northern part of Germany. Also runs a boat in the Fritz Reuter, which is really a great dive boat. So I got hooked up with him, and I went up on a trip to dive some different wrecks in the Baltic. And I knew Uli had dived the Gustloff a number of times. And so he had told me that he wasn't really interested in taking his boat to the Gustloff anymore, but he would put me in contact with someone who would. So he hooked me up with a guy in Poland. And the guy in Poland, however, knew about as much English as I knew Polish, so we had a difficult time communicating. But over a period of time, we managed to set up kind of an exploratory trip to go dive the Gustloff. And at the time, I was diving with some friends in the UK, Starfish Enterprise. They were running trips, an annual trip up to dive the wrecks from the Battle of Jutland. And so I was looking for people to come along on this trip. And so I kind of coordinated the trip to follow up on one of the trips to Jutland, where we would already be over in Europe. And so it was an exploratory trip. I had no idea what was going to happen, but these folks here had the spirit of adventure in them and decided to go along. Brad came all the way from the States, and Lee Bishop, Chris Hutchison, Mike Cross, Tim Ely, Andy Aston, who's on the call here, Dan Stevenson, and Paul Dixon. Myself and Chris and Mike and Tim were all diving up in Denmark from the wrecks of the Battle of Jutland, and Brad flew over, and Andy and Dan and Paul drove over from the UK. And just kind of give you a little more geography of where we were at here. Beginning at the left is Esbjerg, Denmark, which is where the Jutland trips typically depart from. And from there, we traveled down to Lebow near Kiel to look at an exhibit they have on the Wilhelm Gustloff at the Maritime Museum. And then down to Hamburg to pick up Brad. And then we drove over to Poland, and our destination was Hell, Poland. And on the way, we stopped at the museum in Lebow, and they have an incredible model of the Wilhelm Gustloff. So we stopped to take pictures of that. They also have a porthole that was recovered from the wreck some years back. Now, as tragic as the Wilhelm Gustloff story is, the story of us going to dive there is anything but. I almost wish that the diving aspect of it was on a different wreck, because the Gustloff is so tragic. But yet, what happened to us when we got to Poland was anything but. So we got to the place where the boat was at in Hell, and we're looking at the boat, and we get approached by the police. Now, I did take some liberty with the upper left-hand corner. This isn't the policeman who initially stopped us, but it was another one that we had an encounter with later. But we were all at the boat. We had two vans. My van, which was from Germany, and then Chris Hutchison's van. And we get approached by the police, and they ask, it was like a Gestapo movie from World War II. They ask us for our papers. And of course, we get out our passports. We got UK passports, American passports, and the policeman says, green card, and he's pointing at our vehicles. So we figured he's looking for some kind of information about our vehicles. So we go through the glove boxes, And I found a green insurance card in my car. And Hutch, he didn't have anything green at all in his glove box. So anyway, I show the policeman my green card, and Hutch says he doesn't have anything. And he looks at it and he points to it, and it had just expired. I'd been up and diving the wrecks in Jutland for a couple of weeks, and apparently missed this coming in the mail. And while he didn't draw his gun, he did you'd think that he had just captured some international spies. So he decided he was going to pursue this. So they took Chris and I. We became guests of the local police station there. They didn't arrest us, but they told us we couldn't go anywhere. And they impounded our vehicles, and they're loaded with dive gear. I mean, we got all of our dive gear, all of our personal gear. They impounded our vehicles. Fortunately, from where they were impounded, we went to the hotel and they let us get our equipment out. But then they towed our cars to Puch, Poland, and we called it Puch, but they towed it to Puch, Poland. And then they gave us a ride over to the hotel in the police car. So this is how our trip started once we got to Hell, Poland. And the next adventure was the hotel, actually. The guy that I was organizing this trip to, he had lived much of his life behind the Iron Curtain, essentially, but he was not undaunted by that at all. He was quite the capitalist. He owned this hotel, which was primarily used for divers coming to dive different stuff in the area. His ex-wife ran the restaurant in this hotel. He ran a bar downtown, which his current wife managed and ran that. He had a fishing boat, a diving boat. He was involved in everything. But this was the hotel where we were at. You can see, I'm convinced it was either a military barracks or medium security prison at some point in its life. You can see the reception area there in the lower left. And in the lower right was the room that Brad and Lee Bishop and I shared. And there were really no beds. They were just like couches that were kind of broken and laid out. There was no sheets or anything like that. So some of the guys who had been diving up at Jutland, we had sleeping bags and stuff with us that we'd used on the boat. But folks who flew over, like Brad and the guys who drove over from the UK, you figure you're going to be staying at a hotel, at least they're going to have linens and things like that. But no, a lot of us ended up sleeping in our dry suit long underwear. But my favorite view from the hotel was looking at the village of Hell through the barbed wire. It took about 2 days, or 3 days actually, to get the cars sorted out. They towed them to Puch, Poland, which is about 50 kilometers away. And in the meantime, we're trying to get this insurance paper issue sorted out. So there was some time to kill, and we had ordered a bottle of oxygen from the guy who I'd organized the trip to. And we had every kind of fitting that you can imagine. The guys from the UK had all of the UK stuff and Europe stuff, but for some reason, this bottle had a fitting that we didn't have. But we had two very resourceful guys, Mike Cross and Andy Aston. They took that bucket of oily, rusty parts that you see in the upper center there, and Mike Cross fixed the guy's welder, which was broken. And they managed to hobble this connection together. And when they actually started to fill an O2 tank, and you'll see this later in the video, if there was ever going to be an oxygen fire, I figured this would be it. But they were really quite successful. Handy guys to have when you need something done like that. The other interesting thing is Hell, Poland is really not the place you want to dive the Wilhelm Gustloff from. It's a long boat ride from Hell to where the wreck of the Gustloff is. So the guy that I'd organized the trip with, he had a boat that was in Hell, and we did dive a couple days with him down in Hell on some of the really interesting wrecks down that way. And then he had chartered another boat for us up in Le Beau, which is really the closest port to where the Wilhelm Gustloff is, about 30 kilometers away from Hell. However, the first boat that he chartered, the one on the top, it was like a sailboat cockpit. And there were 8 of us, and we're kind of jammed in here. You can kind of see the picture in the upper right. We didn't have a whole lot of room to work with. And we only went out on that boat one day. And then the next couple of days, we did have the boat that you see on the bottom, which was actually really a good dive boat, except for the ladder. And these are trips. We had really spectacular weather the time that we were there to dive the Gustlof. And on one of the days, we had 2 Polish guys that we met who had been trying to get to the Gustlof for years. They just showed up and asked if they could go with us. And we invited them along, and it turned out to be really interesting guys. And I know they've done a lot of diving in the Baltic since then as well. But it was really interesting to learn about some of the other wrecks that these guys are diving in Poland. The Baltic is really an amazing, amazing place. It's kind of similar to the Great Lakes. There's not a lot of growth on the wrecks. And at this time of the year, in May, the water's very clear. But it is very cold. Temperature is just above freezing. Here's just some different pictures of us getting ready to dive. Of course, you know, dry suits, and you want to have a dry suit that's not leaking, obviously, up there, because it is. A number of us had been diving in the North Sea at Jutland wrecks, and you'd think there wouldn't be that much difference between the North Sea and the Baltic, but this just was amazingly cold, and it just like sucked the life out of you practically when you get in the water. The Wilhelm Gustloff sits in 145 feet of water. It sits on its port side, or it's listing to the port side. And the top picture, of course, is Gustloff when it was in service. And the bottom picture is a side scan picture that was taken. And roughly, I sized them so they're roughly about the same. The stern is very, very intact. The midship section is kind of very broken up. And then the bow section is also very intact, but listing all the way over on its port side. And got to take just a break here from the ship and the diving to talk about one of the things that we noticed on the wreck has been really heavily salvaged. The whole center of the wreck is pretty much torn apart in such a way that it's not a natural way for the wreck to collapse. There's obviously been some heavy duty salvage on there. And we were told by the Polish guys up there that during the 60s and early 70s, the Russians did a lot of work on the Gustlof. And there was an exclusion area, you couldn't really go anywhere near it. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, the Gustlof's really, its cargo was human at the time that it went down. You know, what could have possibly been aboard the Gustlof that would have interested the Russians so much? And one of the thoughts was the amber room, which dates back to King Frederick in the 1600s, and it was made out of amber, which is the sap from a conifer tree, and it was fashioned into this majestic room that Catherine the Great eventually expanded upon. Peter the Great, and it was in St. Catherine's Palace when the Germans attacked the Russians, and the Russians, they tried to hide it. They put up a facade in front of it, but the Germans did find it, and they moved it to Königsberg Castle, which is in Danzig Bay, and it stayed there for a big part of the major part of the war. And then when the Russians broke through the Eastern Front, it was boxed up, crated up, and one of the ideas was it was put aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. I've read a lot of stuff on the amber room. It's, you know, I think most historians believe that it was probably destroyed in Königsberg Castle. But whatever was on the Gustloff that interested the Russians to spend that much time on the wreck is kind of interesting. And this was one of the possible options. In more recent years, the amber room has been completely rebuilt, and again back in St. Petersburg, and that's one of the things I definitely want to travel to Russia to see. because it's quite a magnificent sight. These next few pictures are from Lee Bishop, and this is the stern of the Wilhelm Gustloff. And I think this is just an incredible picture. The conditions on the wreck, besides being cold, it was very dark. Lee used a tripod to get this picture, and you can see the stern and all of the railing that's still in place. Another shot Lee took. Then we've got some great shots from Brad Sheard. Brad also used a tripod on his camera, because at the time we were shooting film, we didn't have the capability we have now with the digital cameras. We were shooting with film and black and white film and high speed, and then even pushing it to try to get as much out of the pictures as you possibly can. You can see there's wooden decking still in place, railings in place. A shot of Brad. It gives you kind of an idea. Really, in the lower left-hand picture is the sand level, and in the upper part of the picture is the side of the hull. You can see how much it's collapsed. One of the lifeboat davits. And again, in the Baltic, the wood is very, very preserved. So you see a lot of the wooden decking in place. And I think, to me, this picture really captures it, because you have the lifeboat davits and the lifeboat cradle where the lifeboat would actually sit right there. And these next few pictures are pictures that I took, more of the railing and stairwell. Chris Hutchison on the stern. And on the stern, I remember swimming around the stern, and I could see Hutch and Lee were trying to photograph something, and you could barely make the letters out. And actually, when you're there, you could see it better. But you could see Wilhelm Gustloff, Hamburg, on the side of the hull. And on the left there, you see a rope, which was really from a fishing net that was caught in the stern, and it's moved back and forth enough to scrape the marine growth off the hull, and you can see the white paint. This is actually a slide I meant to take out of there. That's why I had it in red, but I didn't do it. Sorry about that. Well, anyway, this is the team. We had a trying event trying to get on the wreck, but we did prevail, and we managed to dive the wreck and experience a bit of history that was just truly amazing, and managed to capture some images of it and make some unforgettable dives. The next thing is a video that Andy Aston put together, and to me this is the best part of the presentation here, and hopefully it will not buffer too badly, but in the chat I'll put the link to it on YouTube afterwards, in case it doesn't really come off here real well if you want to see it, but it's definitely worth looking at. But and I do want to again say that, you know, as tragic as the Wilhelm Gustloff story is, this video's got some humor involved in it as well, but we all understood exactly the magnitude of what we were doing in the wreck that we were diving. So let's see if we can make this happen here.
Right, Tenacious, you looking forward to this dive? Is it going to be cold? Was it cold last time? Do you think you're going to be cold already now?
In 1972, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security stockade to the Los Angeles underground. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team.
Like that movie, the 18th. That video that Andy put together, I think, says a lot. Again, there was some humor in there, but we were all really well aware of the magnitude of the tragedy of the wreck that we were diving. But it kind of gives you a pretty good idea of what our trip was like. And I did put together a slide of some additional information about the Gustlof. Ed Petrovich, who runs the website WilhelmGustlofMuseum.com, has written a number of books that are just absolutely fantastic. And if you're interested in learning more about the Gustlof, really highly recommend you go to his website. And I believe these books are still available too. And then The Cruelest Night, I know you can find on eBay, and The Damned Don't Drown. It's out of publication as well, but you can find it on eBay. And there's also a really, actually a historical fiction book, Salt in the Sea, or Salt to the Sea rather, that very, very interesting book about that time. Then there's also a book available online, and I think it may be in print now too. It's called A Route to Death. And it not only covers the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustlof and diving it, and from some guys who dived it a number of years after we dived it, it also covers a ship called the Goya and the Steuben, which were also used as part of Operation Hannibal, and both were also sunk by a Russian submarine and with heavy loss of life. Not as much as the Wilhelm Gustlof, but thousands of people were lost on each of those ships as well. And in 2004, we had planned to go back to dive the Gustlof and hopefully get on the Steuben and the Goya. And just literally just a couple of days before the trip, they pulled our permit to dive it because Poland had just joined the European Union, and they wanted to reevaluate how other countries in the Union were handling things like this. So we never did get to go back to dive it. And I know that it's a very difficult wreck to get on. A friend of mine, Mike Barnett, I believe, was trying to get on a trip, and they had a Polish guy whose father was an admiral in the Polish Navy, and they couldn't get a permit to dive it. So it's a wreck that's very difficult to get to, but I feel very fortunate that we were able to get there when we did, and it was an honor to get to dive it, and just a moving experience to be able to witness what had happened. And that's pretty much what I've got. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you were able to take something out of it. Sure, an experience that has stuck with me all these years.